The bell above the antique shop door did not ring. This was the first thing Mrs. Gladys Trewin noticed when she pushed it open at 5 minutes past 9, balancing her umbrella against her knee and already composing an apology for being early. The bell was usually too enthusiastic for the hour, chiming with a confidence that felt almost rude before tea. Its silence suggested either a fault in the mechanism or a discourtesy. She paused on the threshold, unsettled by the absence, and glanced behind her at the empty street as if someone might explain. The shop smelled the same as always: furniture polish, old paper, a trace of lavender that no amount of airing seemed able to remove. Dust lay precisely where it was meant to lie, softening edges without quite surrendering to neglect. Everything appeared in order, which was why the stillness felt wrong. "Mr. Halcombe?" she called, keeping her voice light. She had learned. Over the years, that sounding alarmed often led to embarrassment. There was no answer. Mrs. Trewin stepped fully inside and let the door close behind her. The bell remained mute. She made a mental note to mention it later, assuming there would be a later, and advanced along the narrow aisle between a Georgian writing desk and a stack of framed prints depicting birds that no one could name with confidence. The shop was long rather than wide, with a counter halfway down that divided browsing from business. Beyond it lay the back room, nominally private, though Mr. Arthur Halcombe had never been particularly strict about boundaries. He preferred conversation to order, and believed most things could be improved by being looked at from more than one angle. She saw him then, not at once, but gradually, as one notices something out of place in a familiar room. The angle of his arm, the unnatural stillness of his shoulders, the way his head rested against the glass-fronted cabinet as if he had grown tired mid-thought and decided to sit on the floor. Mrs. Trewin did not scream. She was not a woman inclined to such behavior. Instead, she removed her glove, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. Then she sat down on the nearest chair, because she suspected she might not remain upright otherwise. Only after she had sat did she look properly. Mr. Halcombe's eyes were closed. His mouth was slightly open, giving him an expression of mild surprise, as though he had just been interrupted by a remark he had not expected to hear. One hand lay palm up beside him. The other was tucked beneath his body in a way that suggested discomfort rather than drama. Mrs. Trewin waited for something to change. When nothing did, she stood again, more stiffly this time, and walked to the door of the shop. She opened it, stepped outside, and looked up and down the street with exaggerated deliberation. The village had not yet fully committed to the day. Curtains twitched without parting. A milk crate stood abandoned beside the chemist's. Somewhere, a radio played softly, though she could not tell from where. She returned inside and closed the door. Only then did she allow herself to say very quietly, "Oh dear." Inspector Purbright arrived at 22 minutes past 10, by which time the shop had acquired a small orderly audience. People stood in pairs or alone on the pavement, not quite looking in, not quite leaving. News had travelled in the peculiar way it always did in villages, faster than walking, but slower than denial. Purbright took in the scene without hurry. He noted the open window above the shop front, tilted just enough to admit air, but not explanation. He observed the bell on the door, its cord intact, its mechanism apparently untouched. He listened to Mrs. Trewin's account, delivered with care and a determination not to exaggerate. "And you didn't touch him?" he asked. "Only with my eyes," she said. And briefly at that, Purbright nodded as if this were entirely sufficient. Inside, the shop seemed smaller with other people in it. A constable stood awkwardly near the counter, careful not to knock anything. Another made notes he would later struggle to interpret. Purbright crouched beside Mr. Halcombe with the mild inconvenience of a man who had done this before and never found it improved his knees. There was no sign of disturbance, nothing appeared broken or missing, though this was difficult to say with certainty in a place where disorder was part of the aesthetic. A small table near the back room door held 2 teacups, one drained, the other untouched. The kettle on the sideboard was cold. Purbright straightened and looked around, his expression courteous and unreadable. "Who was last here yesterday?" he asked. "Not to anyone in particular." There was a pause, then several people answered at once, each confident in their own version. A delivery man, a woman asking about a clock. Someone from the council, perhaps? The answers overlapped and contradicted, polite voices edging into firmness. Purbright listened, his gaze drifting to the open window again. It had been left that way deliberately, he thought. Not in a hurry, not by accident. He thanked them all, and asked gently that they allow the constables to do their work. They complied, with the faint reluctance of people who felt they had already contributed more than enough. As the shop emptied, the stillness returned, though it had changed. It was no longer merely quiet, it was attentive. Purbright stood alone, near the counter, and looked down at the folded glove Mrs. Trewin had left behind. He did not touch it. He did not need to. Already the day had begun to tell him things. By 10:30, the antique shop had been restored to a version of order. That satisfied everyone except the truth. Mr. Halcombe had been removed with care and apology, as though he might object to the inconvenience. The floor beneath the glass cabinet was wiped, though not too thoroughly. The shop was closed, but the door remained unlocked, giving the impression of hospitality rather than necessity. Inspector Purbright stood near the counter, listening. Mrs. Gladys Trewin sat opposite him on a chair she had selected herself, favouring one with a straight back and minimal upholstery. Her umbrella rested against her knee like a sentry. She spoke precisely, correcting herself only when accuracy demanded it. "I came to collect the tray," she said, "the Sheffield silver one with the chased edge. Arthur had promised it for the fate raffle. He said it would encourage a certain level of generosity." Purbright nodded. "And when you arrived?" "The bell did not ring," she repeated, as though this detail might yet prove decisive. Everything else was quite as expected, until it wasn't. She described again her discovery, this time with greater attention to sequence. Purbright let her finish without interruption, then asked gently, "Had Mr. Halcombe seemed unwell recently, Mrs.?" Trewin considered this. "No more than usual. He complained of drafts and of the council, and of people who did not understand the difference between old and valuable. Anyone in particular?" She smiled thinly. "Most people, Inspector." When she had gone, Purbright moved slowly around the shop, as though following a route he could not yet see. The teacups drew his attention again. He lifted one by the handle and sniffed, then set it down. No drama suggested itself. Just tea, properly made and left to cool. At 11, Miss Eleanor Finch arrived, breathless but composed, carrying a notebook she did not open. "I'm terribly sorry," she said. "I was told I should come." Purbright gestured for her to sit. Miss Finch was a woman who had learned the value of taking up little space. She perched rather than settled. "You work here?" he asked. "I help out." "Tuesdays and Thursdays." "And when Mr. Halcombe needs someone to catalogue." He disliked computers. "And yesterday?" "I was here until nearly 4. We had a disagreement." Purbright's expression did not change. "About?" "A candlestick," she said promptly. "Or rather 2. He insisted they were early Victorian. I said later." We were both right. In a way. Did the disagreement end badly? She hesitated, then smiled with effort. Arthur enjoyed disagreement. It gave him something to correct. Purbright thanked her and let her go. She paused at the door, turned back, and said, "He had a visitor after I left. A man. I didn't see his face." "That's helpful," Purbright said, and meant something else. Shortly after, Mr. Lionel Bracewell appeared, immaculate as ever, his tie perfectly aligned with his sense of self-importance. "I came as soon as I heard," he announced, glancing around as if the shop might acknowledge him. "You knew Mr. Halcombe well?" Purbright asked. "Professionally," Bracewell replied. "I supplied him with stock, occasionally." "Yesterday?" "Yes, briefly. I dropped off a mirror. He wasn't pleased." "Why not?" Bracewell shrugged. "He rarely was. Said it wasn't what he'd ordered." "I said it was what he needed." Purbright asked about the time. Bracewell supplied it confidently, though later it would be discovered to be imprecise. The morning progressed in this manner. Each visitor brought a version of Mr. Halcombe that suited their memory. None mentioned the open window until Purbright asked directly. "Oh, that," said Mrs. Pennyworth, who had wandered in despite herself. Arthur liked fresh air, claimed it helped with thinking. "Even in November?" she smiled. "Especially then." By midday the shop felt crowded with explanations and empty of certainty. Purbright stood once more by the counter and looked at the polished silver tray resting beneath it, newly wrapped and unremarkable. He touched it at last, leaving a faint print that caught the light. Outside, the village continued its routines with only slight adjustments. Inside, the objects waited, and among them, somewhere, was a lie so polite it almost escaped notice. It took until early afternoon for the shop to feel like itself again, though nothing inside it had moved. Inspector Purbright remained by the counter, watching objects resume their proper stillness. He believed things revealed their value only when left alone, and the village was rarely patient enough to allow that. People valued what could be named, priced, or praised, not what waited quietly for understanding. Mr. Halcombe had known this and traded on it, which was why his absence felt larger than the room that had contained him. Once every shelf and corner had noticed him gone today already. He began with the ledger, a thick book kept beneath the counter like a trusted confidant. Entries were neat but opinionated, prices adjusted according to mood as much as merit. Purbright did not read for numbers alone. He read for emphasis, for what had been underlined twice, for what lacked comment. Several recent items were marked, reserved including the silver tray. No name was attached, only a small star in the margin, suggesting expectation without commitment. It was a useful distinction, one people often missed when money entered conversation politely and left arguments behind afterwards quietly. Every time here, recently. Miss Finch returned just after 1, having remembered something she felt ought to mention. She stood rather than sat, hands folded, voice careful. Arthur had spoken lately of selling the business, she said, though never to whom. He believed ownership changed objects, made them less honest. Purbright asked why she thought this relevant. Miss Finch looked at the cabinets. Because he had begun arguing about value, not authenticity. That was new. She left after, apologizing for interrupting, and Purbright noted how the word selling lingered longer than the sound of her steps outside, fading away slowly again today. Thereafter Mr. Bracewell telephoned at 2, his tone helpful without being asked. He clarified his delivery time, adjusting it slightly earlier. Purbright thanked him and asked about the mirror. Bracewell described it as practical, despite Arthur's theatrics. Mirrors, he added, always showed the truth, whether one liked it or not. After the call, Purbright considered this. Mirrors also encouraged performance, and he suspected Bracewell enjoyed both. A price written in confidence could become a fact, given enough repetition and suitable lighting. Truth, like value, often required agreement before acceptance, especially among men who profited from agreement regularly alone, elsewhere, locally, daily. At 2:30, Mrs. Pennyworth was shown in, ostensibly, to return a book she had borrowed. She spoke fondly of Arthur, of his generosity with discounts and opinions. When asked about arguments, she laughed. "Only about money, Inspector." Arthur disliked people who knew the cost of everything. She meant it kindly. Purbright asked who had discussed money with him recently. Mrs. Pennyworth paused. "Everyone," she said eventually. "Some just did it more softly." She left the book on the counter, its receipt still inside, marking a page on loss and gain, together considered calmly, then placed between covers. Once alone, Purbright opened the back room. The window there was closed, the air stale. A small safe stood unlocked, containing papers rather than jewellery. Among them were letters, unposted, addressed to different people, each beginning politely. None finished politely. They argued for fairness, for time, for recognition. Value appeared often, always qualified. Purbright did not read them all. He read enough to understand that Arthur Halcombe had been measuring his life against other people's. Such measurements rarely ended cleanly. He returned the letters, locking the safe. Some things, he decided, were worth keeping until their weight was understood properly. Later. Outside, the street had grown busier. A van passed, slowing. Purbright watched reflection shift in the glass. He thought again of the silver tray, wrapped and waiting. Objects acquired importance through intention, not appearance. Someone had intended something here and had valued discretion. The open window suggested choice, not haste. Purbright did not yet know whose choice it was, but he knew it would involve someone who understood worth as a conversation, not a number. He closed the shop for the day, carrying with him the quiet certainty that value had been misjudged by someone inside those walls recently before. He left the constable's instructions to mind the premises, though there was little left to guard, except assumptions. At the door, he paused, touching the silent bell. It rang softly now, obedient again. Something had interfered earlier, whether hand or habit, he could not say. The street continued its measured afternoon. Purbright walked toward the square, listening to footsteps behind him that never quite caught up. Value, he thought, was often pursued too eagerly. What mattered here was who had waited and who had not. The difference was already beginning to show in polite faces passing him by slowly today. By 3, the village had settled into its preferred version of events, one that required no reconsideration. Purbright did not share it. He carried with him voices, glances, and small corrections. They weighed more than objects. Somewhere, a conversation had been interrupted too neatly. Someone had believed the price acceptable. Arthur Halcombe had not. That disagreement, Purbright suspected, had been the most valuable thing in the shop. He intended to discover who had tried to close the discussion and why before anyone else decided its worth for themselves again, without permission or witnesses present nearby that day, quietly ending slowly there, now alone. Indeed, again. The following morning arrived with a steadiness the village mistook for reassurance. Inspector Purbright returned to the antique shop just before 10, carrying nothing but a notebook and the memory of several conversations that had not yet finished speaking. The constable on duty unlocked the door and stepped aside, eager to be elsewhere. Inside, the air felt colder than it had the day before, though nothing had changed except attention. The shop no longer waited to be understood. It seemed to observe. Purbright went first to the small table by the back room door. The teacups were still there, untouched since yesterday, positioned with a courtesy that suggested intention rather than habit. He lifted the full cup and saw, beneath the rim, a thin crack running down one side, almost invisible unless the light struck it just so. He wondered how long it had been there, and who had chosen not to mention it. Cracks, he reflected, were often tolerated if the object continued to perform. Mrs. Gladys Trewin arrived shortly after, having decided that involvement was preferable to waiting for explanation. She accepted tea when it was offered elsewhere, but here she declined, eyeing the cups with suspicion. She remarked on the crack at once. Arthur never liked damaged things, she said. He claimed they invited disappointment. Purbright asked whether Arthur had used those cups regularly. Mrs. Trewin thought not. They were part of a mismatched set, kept for visitors who arrived unexpectedly and stayed longer than planned. Miss Finch was next, summoned politely, and arriving with equal politeness. She noticed the cups too, though she did not comment until Purbright asked. Arthur used the uncracked ones himself, she said. He believed it discourteous to offer less than he would accept. Purbright asked whether the crack had been there yesterday. Miss Finch hesitated. She could not be sure. She did remember Arthur pouring the second cup carefully, however, watching the level rise as though measuring something other than tea. He had seemed distracted, she added, though that was not unusual. Distraction was his preferred state when deciding how much to say. The morning progressed with small returns. Mrs. Pennyworth appeared again, this time with purpose. She had remembered the visitor Miss Finch mentioned. A man, yes, but not unfamiliar. Someone who had come before, though rarely alone. She thought he had been arguing quietly with Arthur near the back room. About payment, perhaps, or about time. She could not recall the words, only the tone. It was the sort that suggested agreement had been assumed too early. Purbright thanked her and made a note he did not show. He walked to the back room and opened the window there, letting in a narrow slice of cold air. The silence changed immediately, less settled. He imagined voices raised just enough to carry, then lowered again for politeness. He imagined tea poured, one cup offered, one declined, or accepted reluctantly. He imagined the crack spreading slightly with heat, unnoticed in the moment. People, he thought, rarely inspected what they were handed when distracted by what they wanted. At noon, Mr. Bracewell arrived unannounced, carrying concern like a polished accessory. He noticed the cups and smiled. Arthur had always liked theatrics, he said, made visitors uncomfortable on purpose. Purbright asked whether Bracewell had been offered tea during his visit yesterday. Bracewell frowned, searching memory. Yes, he believed so. He had declined. Arthur had poured it anyway. A habit, Bracewell said. Wasteful. Purbright asked which cup Arthur had used. Bracewell laughed.
Softly, I didn't pay attention, Inspector.
Cups are cups. After Bracewell left, Purbright remained in the back room, listening to the building settle. He examined the kettle, the sink, the small tin of biscuits left unopened. Nothing suggested struggle. Everything suggested interruption. The cracked cup sat apart now, separated by choice rather than accident. Someone had noticed it eventually. Too late to matter. In the afternoon, Purbright walked the village, stopping where conversations naturally slowed. He asked about tea, about visits, about habits, answers aligned in shape, if not detail. Arthur offered tea when he wanted time. He declined it himself when he wanted to end things. A full cup meant patience, an empty one meant resolution. Purbright returned to the shop with this and unlocked the door again. He stood by the counter, holding the cracked cup carefully. The crack ran deeper than he had thought, stopping just short of the base. It would have held barely until pressure changed. He set it down and stepped back. Someone had stayed. Someone had accepted delay. Someone had underestimated fragility, not of porcelain, but of agreement. As evening approached, the shop felt less like a scene and more like a conversation, paused mid-sentence. Purbright closed the door gently. The bell rang, obedient again. Cracks, he reflected, were only dangerous when ignored. Tomorrow he intended to find who had chosen to ignore this one, and why, before the village decided it had always been obvious where it began and how it ended. The next day brought rain that softened the village outlines without disguising them. Inspector Purbright arrived at the antique shop just after 9, coat damp, expression unchanged. He unlocked the door himself and stepped inside with the faint sense of entering a conversation that had resumed without him overnight. Objects seemed rearranged by nothing more than thought. He suspected this was imagination, but imagination often responded to pressure before fact did. He began with the cabinets along the left wall, opening each slowly, handling nothing yet. Arthur Halcombe had been particular about labels. Each item carried a small card, handwritten, detailing origin with confidence, if not certainty. Purbright read them as one might read character references, attentive to what was asserted and what was avoided. Provenance was not truth, Arthur had once remarked to someone, only agreement sustained over time. Miss Finch arrived shortly after, summoned again, and waited by the counter without comment. Purbright asked her to walk with him along the shelves. He asked which items Arthur valued most. She answered carefully. "Not the most expensive," she said, "but the ones with stories that survived inspection." He disliked pieces whose histories improved with repetition. Those were dangerous. Purbright asked if any recent acquisitions had concerned him. She nodded and stopped before a carved box, small and unassuming. It had arrived with paperwork that felt rehearsed. Arthur had kept it back, she said, undecided. Purbright asked who had brought it. Miss Finch named a local man, known more for enthusiasm than reliability. He had come with Mr. Bracewell once before. Purbright thanked her and made a note. Provenance, he reflected, was often shared like blame. The box remained closed. He did not ask to see inside. It was not the contents that interested him yet. Later that morning, Mrs. Pennyworth appeared with another memory, encouraged by tea elsewhere and curiosity here. She spoke of Arthur's irritation in the weeks before his death. He had been correcting people more sharply, especially about where things came from. She recalled him saying provenance was being treated like decoration. He had not liked that. Purbright asked whether she knew who he had argued with most recently. She hesitated. "Then," said Lionel Bracewell, though not exclusively. Bracewell disliked being contradicted. Arthur disliked being rushed. Purbright telephoned Bracewell just before noon and asked him to come in. Bracewell arrived promptly, rain unbothering him. He surveyed the shop with professional fondness. Purbright asked about provenance. Bracewell smiled. "Customers liked stories," he said. "Stories sold." Purbright asked whether stories could become liabilities. Bracewell adjusted his cuff. "Only if questioned." Arthur had questioned too much lately. It made business awkward. They walked together toward the back room. Purbright gestured to the safe. Bracewell acknowledged it with a shrug. "Paperwork," he he said. Overblown importance. Purbright asked whether Bracewell had supplied documentation. Recently that Arthur had rejected. Bracewell paused, then admitted there had been disagreement. Arthur wanted verification. Bracewell believed trust sufficient. Purbright asked whether that disagreement had been resolved. Bracewell said no. Arthur had asked for time. Bracewell disliked delays. After Bracewell left, Purbright opened the safe again. He removed one letter, unfolded it, and read more carefully. It was addressed to a regional dealer requesting confirmation of ownership dates. Polite, persistent. The sort of letter that caused inconvenience. Purbright replaced it and locked the safe. Arthur had been asking questions that reached beyond the village. That suggested motive, but not method. In the afternoon, Purbright visited the council office. He asked about planning applications, permits, disputes. Arthur's name appeared once, attached to a complaint about unauthorized alterations to a listed property. The complaint had been withdrawn abruptly. Purbright asked why. The clerk said Arthur had seemed satisfied after a visit. Purbright asked who had visited. The clerk named a representative. He thanked her and left. Back at the shop, the rain eased. Purbright stood by the open window and considered sequence. Arthur had challenged provenance. That challenged value. Value challenged people who depended on it remaining stable. Someone had visited. Someone had wanted delay avoided. Tea had been poured. A cracked cup had been offered. Patience had been assumed. Miss Finch returned briefly to drop off a ledger she had found at home. It contained older entries, notes in Arthur's hand about questionable items. Several names appeared more than once, Bracewell's among them. Purbright thanked her and asked whether Arthur had seemed afraid. Miss Finch shook her head. Determined, she said. He believed the past mattered. As evening approached, Purbright closed the ledger and returned it beneath the counter. Provenance, he thought, was not just about where things came from. It was about who insisted on knowing. Arthur Halcombe had insisted. Someone else had decided that insistence was inconvenient. Purbright turned off the lights and left the shop, to the sound of rain easing into silence. The village appeared calmer, satisfied that objects had explanations. Purbright knew better. He carried with him the understanding that history, once questioned, resisted being silenced politely. Someone had tried anyway. The matter of provenance was no longer academic. It had become personal, and that, he suspected, was when civility had begun to fail. By the time Inspector Purbright acknowledged that something fundamental had been misunderstood, the village had already agreed on a comfortable explanation. Was spoken gently, without accusation, and passed between people as though it were an item of shared property. Arthur Halcombe, difficult but decent, had argued himself into distress. A weak heart, an unfortunate shock, a regrettable but natural. Conclusion: nothing more was required. Nothing further was welcome. Purbright encountered this version repeatedly as he walked the high street that morning. It was offered with sympathy and relief in equal measure. People preferred causes that required no correction of behavior. He listened, nodded, and allowed the assumption to settle where it had been carefully placed. Only then did he begin to notice how often it was defended. He returned to the antique shop shortly before noon, unlocking the door with the sense that he was intruding on an agreement. Inside, the air felt settled, as though the objects themselves had accepted the prevailing view. Purbright moved through the space slowly, not searching now but reconsidering. He thought again of the teacups, of provenance, of delayed decisions. He thought of Lionel Bracewell's confidence, Mrs. Trewin's precision, Miss Finch's careful loyalty. All pointed in one direction if one wished them to. That, Purbright suspected, was the problem. He sat at the counter and opened his notebook, not to write, but to look at what he had already written. The notes read sensibly enough. Disagreements about value. A man impatient with delay. A cracked cup, an open window. It would be easy to draw a line between irritation and collapse. It would satisfy everyone involved too easily. The wrong assumption, Purbright reflected, was rarely dramatic. It was logical. It felt earned. It survived scrutiny because it aligned with temperament. Arthur Halcombe had been stubborn. Therefore, his death was stubbornness finally insisting on its due. That was how people spoke of it. That was how they excused their own relief. Miss Finch arrived quietly, carrying a small parcel she had found while sorting Arthur's things at home. She placed it on the counter and waited. Inside was a receipt, folded many times, its edges softened by handling. It documented a modest transaction dated several weeks earlier, involving a sum too small to matter. Purbright asked why she had brought it. Miss Finch said Arthur had kept it apart from everything else. He had told her it was important because it didn't look important. Purbright thanked her and asked a question he had not asked before. Had Arthur seemed angry on the last day? Miss Finch considered this carefully. No, she said. He had seemed resolved. There was a difference. Anger required reaction. Resolution required patience. He had poured tea as though he expected conversation, not conflict. He had told her to come back tomorrow. That afternoon, Purbright called on the council, representative whose visit had prompted Arthur to withdraw his complaint. The man received him with professional courtesy and visible discomfort. Yes, he had visited Arthur. Yes, they had spoken at length. Arthur had wanted assurances about a property sale, about documentation. The representative had offered reassurance. Nothing more. Purbright asked whether Arthur had accepted it. The man hesitated. He had accepted time. That was not the same thing. Purbright asked whether anyone else had been present. The representative said no, then corrected himself. A gentleman had arrived. Toward the end. A supplier, perhaps? Confident. He had stayed near the door, listening politely. Purbright did not need a name. As evening approached, Purbright returned once more to the shop. He stood by the back room table, imagining the sequence. Again this time without the assumption of accident. Tea poured, delay requested, documentation demanded, someone unwilling to wait, someone convinced that persuasion had already occurred. The crack in the cup no longer seemed incidental. It seemed symbolic of a tolerance exceeded. The village assumption relied on Arthur being alone in his final moment. Purbright no longer believed that. Too many people remembered being expected. Too many remembered conversations that were meant to continue. Someone had been present who did not wish to be remembered. Someone whose interest lay in the story ending neatly. Purbright closed the notebook and looked around the shop one last time that day. Objects reflected lamplight without comment. They had been valued incorrectly before. He suspected the same error had been made with people. Arthur Halcombe had not died of insistence. He had died because someone else had insisted harder. The wrong assumption persisted outside, untroubled. Purbright stepped into it politely, allowing it to pass around him. Tomorrow he thought it would require adjustment, not confrontation, just understanding. The village would resist at first. They always did. But assumptions like antiques lost value once provenance was examined closely. The village began to adjust itself without announcement. Inspector Purbright noticed it first, in the pauses between greetings, in the way questions were no longer asked directly, but framed as observations instead. People altered their accounts slightly, not enough to be noticed by anyone else, but enough to ease their own discomfort. Certainty softened into preference. Memory became selective. It was not dishonesty. It was preservation. Purbright allowed this to continue. He spent the morning walking familiar routes, stopping where conversation was already underway. He did not correct anyone. He listened for changes in emphasis, for details newly omitted. Mrs. Trewin now described Arthur as tired rather than irritable. Mrs. Pennyworth no longer mentioned argument, only discussion. Even Bracewell, encountered outside the bank, spoke of misunderstandings rather than disputes. Each adjustment made the village more comfortable and the truth more precise. At the antique shop, Purbright made his own small alterations. He moved the cracked teacup back into its original position among the others, no longer set apart. He returned the silver tray to its place beneath the counter, removing the wrapping. It caught the light differently now, not brighter, but more assertive. Objects, he believed, responded to context. People did as well. Miss Finch arrived mid-morning with a list Arthur had asked her to prepare weeks earlier. It detailed items he intended to sell privately, bypassing intermediaries. Several names appeared beside the entries, some crossed out, some underlined. Bracewell's name appeared twice, once firmly, once faintly erased. Purbright asked when. The list had been made. Miss Finch said Arthur had revised it the day before he died. He had seemed satisfied, she said, as though a decision had been reached even if not yet shared. Purbright thanked her and asked whether Arthur had expected resistance. Miss Finch smiled faintly. Arthur expected resistance from everyone, she said. It was agreement that unsettled him. She left, and Purbright noticed she did not linger as she once might have. Her loyalty had shifted from defense to disclosure. That, he thought, was progress. In the afternoon, Purbright called on Lionel Bracewell again, this time at his
office.
Bracewell received him with practiced ease, offering tea immediately. Purbright accepted. They spoke of the weather, of business, of Arthur's unfortunate passing. Bracewell expressed regret with care. Purbright listened until the tea cooled. "You were in the shop later than you remembered," Purbright said eventually, not accusing, merely adjusting. Bracewell frowned slightly.
"I may have lost track of time. You were there when the council representative was leaving." Bracewell hesitated, then nodded. "Briefly? And Arthur asked you to wait?" "Yes." "You declined." Bracewell smiled thinly. "I
dislike delays," Purbright nodded. Arthur relied on them. The conversation did not escalate. It did not need to. Bracewell corrected himself twice, volunteering details he had not been asked for. He spoke of patience as though it were an inconvenience imposed by others. Purbright thanked him and left without comment. Back in the village, Purbright noticed how people now spoke of Bracewell with caution. No one accused him. They simply allowed for possibility. It was enough. Assumptions require consensus to survive. Doubt needed only space. That evening, Purbright returned to the shop alone. He stood in the back room and opened the window again, just enough to change the air. He imagined the moment as it must have been. Arthur seated, composed, expecting negotiation. Bracewell standing, impatient, expecting compliance, tea offered, Time requested. Refusal framed as efficiency, a gesture too abrupt, a reaction too late to be withdrawn. Purbright did not imagine violence. He imagined insistence, pressure applied without regard for fragility. The cracked cup made sense then, not as cause but as witness. Something had been set down too hard. Something else had failed. The village, meanwhile, continued its quiet adjustments. People corrected their stories before being asked. They recalled hearing voices rather than silence. They remembered that Arthur had seemed calm. No one suggested murder. They did not need to. Understanding was assembling itself carefully, without spectacle. Purbright closed the shop for the night and walked toward the square. He felt no urgency now. The shape of the truth was settling into place, aided rather than hindered by civility. No one would be confronted. No confession would be demanded. The village would arrive at its conclusion politely, one adjustment at a time. By the time darkness fell, the story had changed without anyone admitting it had. Arthur Halcombe was no longer a man overtaken by his own temperament. He was a man who had insisted on fairness and been answered with impatience. That distinction mattered. Tomorrow, Purbright thought, it would matter enough. Inspector Purbright returned to the antique shop in the early afternoon, when the village was least inclined to notice him. Luncheon had been taken, errands completed, interest temporarily satisfied. This was the hour when conclusions rested unguarded. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind him. The bell rang, obedient and mild, as though nothing had ever interfered with it. He did not begin at the counter this time. Instead, he stood just inside the doorway and looked toward the back room, aligning his view, as it must have been, on the afternoon Arthur Halcombe died. Distance mattered. Perspective altered meaning. From here, the shop appeared narrower, the back room more exposed. Anyone standing near the door would have been able to see the table clearly, to observe gestures without intruding. It was a position of advantage that pretended to be courtesy. Purbright walked the length of the shop slowly, counting steps without appearing to. He stopped beside the glass cabinet where Arthur had been found and crouched, not to examine the floor, but to understand height. Arthur had been seated. That much was clear. A seated man was vulnerable in ways a standing one rarely acknowledged. He could be spoken over. He could be pressured politely. Purbright stood again and moved to the small table. The teacups were arranged as they had been before, restored by habit rather than instruction. One cup bore the faint crack. Purbright lifted it, turned it in his hands, then set it down precisely where it had stood. He imagined Arthur pouring tea, speaking calmly, explaining the need for verification. He imagined the other man listening, with a patience that was not patience at all, listening only long enough to interrupt effectively. Purbright stepped back toward the door, placing himself where the visitor had stood. From here, the window was visible, slightly open. Air moved through it, enough to unsettle papers, enough to cool tea left untouched. It was a small opening, but deliberate. Someone had opened it. Someone who intended to stay long enough for it to matter. He considered timing again. The council representative had left. Arthur had asked for time. Bracewell had declined delay. Words had been exchanged that sounded reasonable. Voices had remained low, nothing that would draw attention. Politeness, Purbright reflected, was an excellent cover for impatience. He reenacted the final moments without theatrics. A disagreement unresolved, a document withheld, a demand reframed as efficiency. Arthur seated, listening, refusing to concede. Bracewell standing, gesturing perhaps too sharply, stepping closer without intending threat. Pressure applied through. Proximity rather than force. A hand on the table. A cup shifted. A sound too slight to register beyond the room. Purbright did not imagine intent, he imagined consequence. He moved back to the counter and sat where Miss Finch often had, considering what might have been said next had Arthur lived. He would have insisted on confirmation, he would have delayed sale, he would have written letters, he would have been inconvenient. That, Purbright thought, was motive enough for irritation, not for violence, but irritation, sustained and unchecked, could become something else when combined with certainty. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Pennyworth stood outside, peering in with hesitation. Purbright let her in. She looked around, uncomfortable now that the shop no longer belonged to Arthur. "I was thinking," she said, as though apologizing. "About that day," Purbright waited. "I remember hearing a cup," she said. "Not
Breaking? Just set down! When? He asked. She frowned. Later than I first thought.
after the voices stopped. Purbright nodded. This was new, though it changed nothing essential. It confirmed sequence. He thanked her and let her go. She seemed relieved, as though having contributed something, she could now stop thinking. Alone. Again, Purbright returned to the back room and opened the window fully this time. The air shifted decisively. Papers stirred. The room felt less contained. He imagined Bracewell turning toward the window, irritated by the draught, moving without thinking. Arthur remaining seated, unwilling to rise. The imbalance mattered. Purbright closed the window and stood still, letting the silence settle. The scene no longer required reconstruction. It required acknowledgement. What had happened was small. A gesture misjudged. A moment pressed too far. No raised voices. No witnesses eager to intervene. Just a conclusion reached without agreement. He replaced everything exactly as he had found it. The cracked cup among the others. The chair pushed in, the table cleared. When he stepped back toward the door, the shop looked unchanged. That was as it should be. The truth had never required rearrangement, only attention. Outside, the village continued with measured calm. Purbright locked the door and placed the key in his pocket. The small scene had been revisited, understood, and set aside. What remained was how to allow the village to arrive at it themselves without shock or spectacle. As he walked away, he felt the quiet certainty of sequence restored. Nothing dramatic had been overlooked. Nothing excessive had occurred. A small insistence, a refusal to wait, a moment of imbalance, that was all. And it had been enough. Inspector Purbright allowed a full day to pass before speaking to anyone again. The village used the time productively, filling silence with conclusions that required no official endorsement. By the following morning, nothing new was being added, which told Purbright everything he needed to know. When people stopped elaborating, they were protecting something fragile. He began with Miss Finch, inviting her to walk with him rather than sit. They moved through the village slowly, past shops that no longer asked questions. Purbright spoke of Arthur Halcombe in neutral terms, inviting correction. Miss Finch supplied none. Instead, she spoke of routine, of habits Arthur had cultivated. To avoid confrontation, he preferred implication to declaration, she said. He believed saying less gave others room to be honest. Purbright asked whether Arthur had said anything unusual on the last day. Miss Finch thought for a long moment, then said no. He had said nothing. That, she realized now, was unusual. Later, Purbright visited Mrs. Trewin, who offered tea and exact recollection. She spoke of Arthur's principles, his insistence on fairness. When Purbright asked what Arthur had said about Lionel Bracewell, Mrs. Trowin smiled thinly. Arthur had said very little, she replied. He had raised an eyebrow once, that was all. Purbright asked whether that had been enough. Mrs. Trowin considered, then nodded. Arthur believed restraint was persuasive. He underestimated how others heard silence. In the afternoon, Purbright called on Bracewell without appointment. Bracewell received him with civility, though something had shifted. He spoke more carefully now, choosing words that could not be misinterpreted later. Purbright listened, then asked a question he had avoided until now. "What did Arthur not say to you?" Bracewell laughed lightly, dismissive. Arthur enjoyed saying things. "Not always," Bracewell hesitated. "He didn't accuse me?" Purbright nodded. And that mattered. Bracewell's expression tightened. He said Arthur had implied dissatisfaction, nothing more. He had expected negotiation, not obstruction. Purbright asked whether Arthur had asked him to wait. Bracewell admitted he had. Purbright asked whether Bracewell had agreed. Bracewell said no. That, Purbright suggested, was where things had been left unsaid. Bracewell said nothing further. That evening, Purbright returned to the antique shop one final time. He did not unlock the door. He stood outside, looking through the glass. Reflections layered the interior with the village behind him. It struck him then how much of the case had depended on absence. No shouted argument, no threat, no witness who heard too much. Arthur Halcombe had relied on implication, on shared understanding. Bracewell had relied on momentum. Between them lay a silence. Neither had interpreted the same way. Purbright considered how easily the matter could have been explained away if one insisted on words alone. Nothing explicit had occurred, no demand, no refusal recorded, only expectation, unmet. The village had assumed the rest. That assumption had nearly succeeded. The following morning, Purbright met with the coroner. He presented no accusation, only sequence. A seated man. A standing one. Pressure without force. A moment misjudged. The coroner listened, asked questions and nodded slowly. It was enough. The cause would be adjusted. No drama. Just accuracy. News travelled again, quieter this time. People absorbed it without resistance. They had already sensed the change. Bracewell was spoken of less confidently now, his name paired, with pauses. No one confronted him. They did not need to. He began avoiding the village soon after, his business conducted elsewhere. That too required no explanation. Purbright visited Mrs. Pennyworth once more, thanking her for her memory. She said she was glad she had spoken when she did. Purbright told her it had mattered. She asked whether Arthur would have approved. Purbright said Arthur would have preferred it remain understated. At the end of the week, Miss Finch came to the station to ask about the shop. She wondered whether it might reopen. Purbright said it could, if she wished. She said she would think about it. Arthur had believed things deserved continuity, she said. Purbright agreed. On his final walk through the village, Purbright noticed how often people now mentioned what Arthur had not said. He had not complained. He had not accused. He had not rushed. These omissions had become virtues in retrospect. That pleased Purbright. It suggested the village had learned something without being taught. What had not been said, he reflected, had carried more weight than anything spoken aloud. Arthur Halcombe had trusted silence to do the work of truth. Someone else had mistaken it for consent. That mistake had ended a life, quietly, without intent. Understanding it required listening to absence, and the village at last had done so. Purbright left without ceremony. The case resolved itself behind him, not with relief, but with recognition. No one spoke of murder. No one needed to. The truth had settled into place gently, supported by everything that had gone unsaid, and that, Purbright thought, was the only conclusion Arthur Halcombe would have accepted. Inspector Purbright did not announce the adjustment. It would have been discourteous to do so, and discourtesy was not required. The village understood shapes better than statements, and this one was already forming. People held doors longer, conversations paused at thresholds, decisions were delayed, politely, as if time itself had asked to be considered. Purbright spent the morning returning small things. A notebook to Miss Finch, who accepted it without opening. A receipt to Mrs. Trewin, who thanked him for remembering. He said nothing about why these items mattered. Courtesy allowed meaning to settle without insistence, and he relied on that habit now. At the antique shop, the silver tray was polished and placed in the window, not for sale, but for visibility. It caught the light and reflected the street, including passers-by who slowed without knowing why. Purbright watched from across the road. Visibility, he knew, was a form of pressure that required no words. Lionel Bracewell arrived shortly after 11, his steps measured, his expression prepared. He paused when he saw the tray, then entered. The bell rang softly. Purbright followed, closing the door behind them. The shop felt neutral, which was the point. They spoke of ordinary matters first, business elsewhere. Weather. A mutual acquaintance who had moved on. Bracewell was careful, courteous, and increasingly precise. Purbright let him be. Precision often revealed the outline of what it tried to contain. "You won't be reopening," Bracewell said eventually, gesturing toward the shelves. "Not today," Purbright replied. Bracewell nodded, as though relieved. "It would be complicated." "Complication depends on approach," Purbright said. Arthur preferred time, Bracewell smiled. Arthur preferred leverage. Arthur preferred fairness. The correction was gentle. Bracewell accepted it with a tilt of the head, as one accepts a minor amendment. He spoke then of misunderstandings, of moments that felt larger in retrospect. Purbright listened without interruption. When Bracewell finished, the shop felt smaller. "What would you like to do now?" Purbright asked. Bracewell hesitated. He had expected options framed as warnings. Courtesy disarmed him. He said he would like matters concluded. Quietly. "So, would the village?" Purbright said. They discussed arrangements without naming consequences. Bracewell would withdraw certain claims. He would correct documentation where ambiguity had benefited him. He would refrain from future involvement with the shop. None of this was demanded. It was presented as alignment. Bracewell agreed, relieved, to find agreement possible again. As he left, he paused by the counter. "Arthur was difficult," he said. Purbright nodded. Arthur was careful. Outside, Bracewell walked away without looking back. The street resumed its rhythm. No one stared. Courtesy had shaped the exit. In the afternoon, Purbright met the coroner once more to confirm the wording. Language mattered. It could wound, or it could settle. They chose carefully. The adjustment would stand without emphasis. Miss Finch returned. At 4, carrying keys. She stood in the doorway uncertain. Purbright told her the shop could reopen when she wished. She asked whether people would come. Purbright said they would because they would want to behave well. That was often reason enough. They walked through the rooms together. Miss Finch straightened a label, replaced a chair, closed the window. Each action restored proportion. She
asked whether Arthur would have approved of how things had ended.
Purbright said Arthur would have approved of how they continued. As evening approached, the village gathered itself into routine. Doors closed. Lights came on. Stories settled into their preferred lengths. Purbright walked toward the station, aware that his work here was complete, not because everything had been said, but because everything had been placed. Courtesy, he reflected, had a shape. It curved around conflict and softened its edges. It allowed people to accept responsibility without humiliation. It asked for adjustment, not surrender. In this village, it had done its work quietly, which was the only way it ever did. Purbright paused once, looking back at the shop window where the tray reflected the lamplight. The reflection included him briefly, then did not. That seemed appropriate. He continued on, satisfied that the matter would hold, supported by civility, and that nothing further needed to be pressed into speech. He did not expect thanks. The village would not offer them, and he would not accept them. Resolution here took the form of continued manners, of invitations kept and tempers moderated by habit. People would remember Arthur Halcombe with a particular kindness reserved for those who had been right too often. They would recall his pauses, his raised eyebrow, his preference for letting others speak themselves into clarity. That memory would guide future dealings more effectively than warning ever could. Purbright trusted that. He trusted the way courtesy shaped outcomes without announcing them. It was not justice in the grand sense, but it was fitting. The village would keep its peace not by forgetting, but by arranging what it knew so it could live with it. He adjusted his pace, letting the
evening claim him. Tomorrow would bring another place, another arrangement, another quiet insistence on understanding.
For now, this one was complete, and completeness, he thought, was best recognized by leaving it undisturbed. It remained a courtesy to depart without flourish, to allow the village its calm, and to trust that understanding would endure through ordinary days, steady habits, and the quiet decency people practiced together. Morning arrived without ceremony, and Inspector Purbright allowed it to pass that way. He attended to paperwork that required little thought, signing where expected, leaving margins untouched. The village had already completed the work that mattered. Nothing waited to be announced. Nothing waited to be corrected. Order had been restored not by instruction, but by habit. He returned once more to the antique shop at mid-morning, at Miss Finch's invitation. The door was open, the bell ringing freely again. Sunlight lay across the floorboards, revealing dust without accusing. Miss Finch stood behind the counter, not presiding, merely present. She had chosen restraint over reinvention, and it suited the place. They spoke briefly of practicalities. Accounts would be settled. Certain items returned to their owners. Others would remain, offered honestly, their histories stated with appropriate caution. Miss Finch said she intended to keep Arthur's ledger. Purbright approved. It was not evidence anymore. It was memory, and memory required care. Before leaving, Purbright walked the length of the shop one last time. He did not pause by the cabinet or the backroom table. He had learned what he needed there. Instead, he stopped at the window and looked out. The village moved past in ordinary sequence. People greeted one another with consideration that was not performative. Courtesy had become reflex again. At the station, the final report was completed without flourish. Language was chosen for clarity rather than emphasis. The coroner's findings aligned neatly. No one objected. No one requested elaboration. The matter closed itself with the quiet efficiency of an understood rule. That afternoon, Purbright encountered Mrs. Trewin near the post office. She thanked him for returning her receipt, though it had never truly been missing. She asked whether things were settled now. Purbright said they were. She nodded, satisfied, and spoke of the fate instead. Plans had resumed. That too was a sign. Lionel Bracewell was not mentioned. His absence had become its own explanation. People accepted it without comment, the way one accepted that certain shops closed earlier than others, or that some conversations were best concluded before they began. The village did not require acknowledgement of responsibility to recognize its outline. As evening approached, Purbright prepared to leave. He packed lightly, as he always did. Miss Finch came to the station to say goodbye, bringing with her a small wrapped parcel. Inside was the cracked teacup. She had glued it carefully, the lines still visible. "I couldn't throw it away," she said. It seemed wrong. Purbright accepted it. "Some things deserve to be kept," he said, and meant both object and gesture. He did not suggest repair beyond what had been done. The crack remained part of its story. When the train arrived, the village gathered itself into background. No one waved, no one stared. Purbright took his seat and watched the platform recede. He did not feel satisfaction, only balance. An orderly conclusion was not an ending, it was an agreement to proceed. As the countryside passed, he reflected on Arthur Halcombe, on his insistence and his patience. Arthur had believed that fairness once stated would hold. He had underestimated how often fairness required protection. That protection, in the end, had come not through accusation, but through arrangement. The village had adjusted, and the adjustment had held. Purbright closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. There would be other places, other silences to interpret. He carried with him the knowledge that resolution did not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrived with manners, with the steady correction of course that allowed people to continue without rupture. Behind him, the antique shop resumed its life. Objects waited. Stories remained available but not imposed. Miss Finch would learn the balance Arthur had practiced, perhaps with less risk. The village would remember him kindly and cautiously. That was as much justice as it would ever require. The train moved on, and with it the case settled fully into the past. Nothing more would be said, nothing more needed to be. The conclusion held its shape, supported by ordinary days and the quiet understanding that some truths were best preserved by the way people chose to live with them. It was not resolution he valued most, Purbright thought, but proportion. Each element had found its place without force, without display. The village would continue to adjust quietly when necessary, guided by what it had learned without being instructed. That was the advantage of civility. It endured. Arthur Halcombe had trusted that endurance, and in the end it had answered him better than argument ever could. Purbright leaned back as the train curved away, content to let memory settle where it belonged. Cases ended, but habits remained. In villages such as this, habits were stronger than verdicts. They shaped behavior long after official language faded. He would remember the shop, the cup, the patience that had been demanded and denied. He would remember, too, the way understanding had arrived sideways, through pauses and small courtesies, and how that arrival had been sufficient. Nothing remained unfinished, and the village accepted that completeness without protest, quietly.